Hello, and welcome to the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. Each episode, we talk about a particular topic in the life of a professor. Ruth is a visiting professor at a large university in Ireland, and Claire is an associate professor at a primarily undergraduate university in Northern California. The purpose of our podcast is reflection, so we bring something we think is working and something we're working on to discuss.
Welcome to the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. I'm Ruth.
And I'm Claire. And today we're talking about fad or fundamental. But first, Ruth, how was your week?
My week was good. Today I had rather an intense experience. I think probably most parents have had these experiences where it's children's birthday parties at places that are there's one where we used to live called Bounce-A-Palooza, but it's basically a place with inflatable bounce houses, but
oh yeah, those things,
way more intense, and it was a lot. There was 6 separate birthday parties happening in this place, and it was just because the ones I went to where we lived were really small and still really overwhelming, but this was it was a full sensory onslaught. So I was just whoa. So the kids and me have all been very quiet since we came back.
Need some calm time after all that.
They had a blast, but it was just, yeah, it was a lot. So
wow,
we're recovering from the inflatable party place.
That sounds fun.
It was really fun, but it was just a lot. And I don't know if I've mentioned this on here. I'm still coming to terms with driving.
Oh yes,
here,
how it's different in Ireland.
Yeah, and I actually I got a driving lesson about going on the motorway.
Really? What?
Yeah, because I just it's so stupid, but most of my driving life was in America.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, 9 years compared to 1 year driving here. So it's definitely that's my default all the time, and I still sometimes have wait, which side of the road am I on? And
oh my goodness, that sounds really scary.
I know, and I talked to someone recently who was going to mainland Europe, but they brought their Irish car. I don't think I could do that, because at least here, when I'm driving, I'm on the other side of the car.
Yes,
so that helps, because I'm I should be at the center of the road. That's my go-to. But I don't think I could drive an American car here. I think there would be a crash within 3 seconds. But yeah, roundabouts, really big roundabouts it's a lot.
Yeah.
So, and there's a lot of big roundabouts, going on to freeways, and yeah.
Wow.
That's a lot.
I remember driving around, I guess this was England, but there were so many roundabouts, and I found it really, I not being used to roundabouts, I was having trouble remembering which way we'd turned, because we always are curving around the same direction. So did we make an overall left turn or right turn? I don't remember. It wasn't intuitive to me to keep track of that. And that was an interesting added challenge.
Yeah, and it's whatever the Google Maps person, they aren't giving me the information in the way I want it. Do you know what I mean? Or they're just you're taking the exit that's northeast, and I'm which number? How many roads? It's not working for me.
Spinning around in a circle, I can't keep track of which way is northeast.
yeah. The kids have actually started being there's a roundabout, we're going to be quiet.
Oh, that's nice of them.
That's very helpful, because they know I'm if I'm going to fall apart, it's going to be on a roundabout. So yeah, that's what will happen. But tell me, how was your week?
Oh, my week was good. So I wanted to report that I've been doing these self-graded exams for the first time this semester.
Oh, wait,
and I had my second one.
Ooh,
yeah.
Cool.
And it was good. It was still really positive. So yeah, and for anyone who didn't listen to the self-graded exam episode, the idea is that they do a take-home exam, and then we chat about the answers, and everybody comes up with, overall, we have correct answers by the end of a discussion on the day when they hand in their exams, and then they grade themselves. And this was the second time that they did it, and the second time that I did it, and overall it was still very positive, and I still got comments oh, this has been really helpful for reviewing the content and all that. But I did have a little bit of trouble. I had made some multi-part questions, and I told them to score themselves just one score for the multi-parts, and that got a little bit confusing, because it was well, I got this one 100% right, but this one 100% wrong, but there's no half score. So anyway, I think I need to be a little more careful about that kind of thing in the future. But it was not really a big deal. It was just a little confusing on the grade.
Yeah. It sounds like, I don't know if this is true, but it sounds like you have like that group is really good.
I think so.
That's
Yeah.
brilliant then, because then you can just figure out all this stuff with
Yeah,
them
with a
instead
nice-
of like, right, because you could imagine if something like that could happen like the first time with a bad group, then they would be like, we hate everything about this. We never, you know what I mean? And so like, that's super
Yeah.
cool that you can iron out some of those things.
Yeah, testing it out with a nice, engaged, enthusiastic group has been
Yes.
very positive.
So tell me,
Good.
you're doing a quote for us this week.
Yes, and I'm bringing it back to one of my favorite quoter people, Jen Sincero.
Oh, quoter people. I love that. We need to have a list of the quoter people. Go for it. Sorry.
So Jen Sincero wrote, "You are a badass," which I've definitely quoted from a million times before. And this is actually her quoting Mark Twain. So I guess I'm really quoting Mark Twain. But I ran into the quote in "You are a badass." Anyway, it's a nice. I bet most of us have heard this quote before, and I love this quote. So here it is. "I have lived a long life and had many troubles, most of which never happened." And that's in the
Wow.
chapter, "The Drama of Overwhelm," and just a reminder to not be too bogged down by troubles that haven't actually happened, you know?
Yeah. Easier said than done, but yes.
Definitely. But
Yes,
very
yes.
nice to remember. Yeah, the chapter on overwhelm definitely speaks to me.
Yeah.
Jen Sincero
And
is the
it
best.
spoke to my experience earlier on at that birthday party, but it was like, it's just a lot of things happening.
Too much
But
happening.
totally.
So many
But tell
bouncing
me,
children.
so so today we're talking about fads versus fundamentals,
Yes.
and how would we kind of define that, I guess, or what is it we're talking about?
Totally. So the way that I'm kind of thinking about it is fads are temporary things that come up, and they can be good or bad. But the fundamental is what we're actually trying to do with the fad. So like a fundamental might be providing an environment that students learn well in. But then
Yeah.
the fad is, well, what are some different ways that we could go about doing that? And so I'm thinking about how to explore the fads and maybe see what fundamental they're calling on. And also thinking about, I think it might be easy without understanding the fad to do the fad and accidentally throw out the fundamental while trying this new fad. So I'm trying to understand, thinking about these different fads coming around. What fundamental are they trying to support, and how can we best try them out and use them that way?
I
Yes,
love
what-
that.
yeah,
I
what
love
are
that
you
definition.
thinking?
Well, that's, yeah, kind of the same thing. And then just, I guess the fundamentals, and I wonder, is the fundamentals kind of a personal thing? Like you decide, like your value system or whatever, just the absolute essential things that have to happen in your classroom are.
Sure.
And then, yeah, the fads. But it's so funny, right? Because I think, you know, if someone listened very briefly to the self-graded exams, that could easily sound like, do you know what I mean? But it's
Totally.
so in all the structure you built around it, and do you know what I mean? Like it, yeah.
I think it is a fad. It's a specific way of trying to get at the fundamental. And for me, the fundamental with self-graded exams, there's a bunch of them. There's engagement with the material. There's assessing the students. There's trying to be time efficient. And all those fundamentals I'm trying to address with this particular thing, which I'm calling a fad, of self-grading. But maybe self-grading is going to stand the test of time and end up being a great way of
Yeah.
continuing to address these fundamentals for
But
a
I
while.
think if you didn't have your fundamentals set up in your class,
Sure.
it would fall apart.
Right.
But
right.
yeah.
Doing the self-grading without knowing what I'm trying to get out of it would probably be less effective, I think.
Yeah.
I was thinking of an interesting example with standardized tests. I was trying to think, like, what are some fads that have come and gone, and Ralph and I were talking about it. And it seems to me like the fundamental goal with standardized tests is we want a fair way to assess students, regardless of what school they've gone to and stuff like that. And so one fad a while ago was, hey, let's make these standardized tests. Everyone will take the same test, and that'll be a fair solution to unequal schooling, and we'll try to design the tests so that it's not about what you learned in school, but about your aptitude or whatever. Great solution, very well intentioned. But now there's more of a fad that's like, wait, standardized tests themselves are unfair. Maybe that's not the way to solve this problem. So both of these are trying to address this fundamental of what's a fair way to assess the students. And we're kind of going through different phases of, well, how are we actually going to do that?
Totally. And then there's the danger too of a fad just becoming a fundamental just by existing for long enough.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
And that would be okay if it would actually be really effective. But if it just becomes a thing that everybody does without thinking about whether it's effective, then that would be a problem. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question for you at the end. Remind me.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'll
okay.
let you know.
Some foreshadowing. It's coming. So tell me, what do you think works for you about this sort of fads versus fundamentals?
Sure. So I was thinking about active learning, and I think that's a fad. It's come up relatively recently, and everybody was talking about it. And so everybody's, talking about different ways of doing active learning, different particular activities, think, pair, share, and all these different things get all these different names, and everybody's sharing them with each other. That's a fad from my definition. But I think it's coming from this fundamental of engagement promotes learning. And I think that is a fundamental, and that's been around forever. We're always trying to engage our students, and now active learning is getting more discussion and more specific terms, and more people are talking about different ways about going about it. Overall, I think that is great. I am really finding it useful to hear about all these different ways about doing engagement in the classroom, about active learning, all these different styles, and I'm finding it really useful to take the ones that work for me. And we've talked about how, something might be really effective for someone else, but not super effective for me. So I'm taking the pieces of active learning that are working well for me and incorporating them into my classes. And so I've talked about before on the podcast how my favorite style for lectures is I'm presenting content and leading a discussion, but there's lots of engagement and lots of interaction and lots of times where the students are talking with each other or working on problems or whatever, answering and asking questions. So I feel like it's very active, and I'm using a lot of the active learning tools that I learned from this being this fad to hit my fundamentals of engagement promotes learning and students interacting with the material in the classroom and all that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like too, like even when you're saying active learning, some of these things are discussed in, like, one thing I really loved the episode about your self-graded tests. I'm going back to that again. Uh-huh. But it's because, like, it just is something that you could hear in passing and, like, even misunderstand what's going on or how to actually implement it. And the devil is always in the details. Like, it's really important, do you know what I mean, to, like, fully understand what these things are. Mm-hmm. And then, for sure.
Exactly.
Whether they're addressing your values in the class.
Exactly. Like just taking an active learning thing or taking self-grading and applying it without the context of what the goal is and how to make it work for whatever fundamental goal we have is a challenge. And that's why, I had heard the term self-grading before and was like, well, that sounds really weird. I don't think I want to do that. That sounds pretty impossible and ineffective, is my initial response when I don't understand how it works. But upon hearing more about it, I was like, oh, okay, I can see how that would be fundamentally useful.
Yeah, nice. I like it.
Anyway, what's working for you?
So I think for me, some of my musings for this episode was just thinking about what I consider fundamental.
Oh, cool.
And like, I think the most important thing for me is organization. And I think
I love it.
No matter how amazing a fad is, if you don't have good organization, like I feel like so many people told me this when I started teaching, and I was like, sure, but it's true. Like organization is absolutely everything. And I think it's such a huge part of building trust with students that they can just be like, there's going to be, even if they hate the structure or whatever it is, just that there is a pattern and the person is going to be organized is so important.
Now, what does organization mean to you in this case?
I think, well, so for one thing here is like, say stuff like letting students know when exams are going to be. Do you know what I mean? Like that's huge. Coming to class and like having a lecture plan. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I have heard, of other professors who like definitely part of me admires their confidence, but just come in and just go from like whatever they're thinking about. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? And like maybe that's just a different skill set, but for me that's no. And it's so funny, once I had a student, so I would have my binder of notes pre-pandemic and like I had everything organized by weeks in the semester. And one student was like, it's very relaxing to me that you have that. And I was like, okay, I didn't. But you know what I mean? Like, they
Uh-huh.
liked that there was, like, I don't know, clearly a structure to things.
Mm-hmm.
And being prepared for class, I think, is huge. Do you know what I mean?
I can see. I mean, yeah, from the student perspective, it seems like you can get on board with this plan. It's been thought out, and you can relax into knowing that you're being taken somewhere intentional if you see all that organization. That
Yes,
seems,
totally.
yeah.
Totally. And I think also, and this seems to be true for teachers at every stage, but like being unprepared is just, it doesn't, yeah, it's just not a safe, relaxing environment for the student. Do you know what I mean? And they know if you're unprepared.
Sure.
Do you know what I mean? So
It's reminding me too of like how you present things. You know, like you're going to try this new fad, and if you present it with confidence and this is why we're going to do it and it's going to be super cool, that's totally different than if you're like, we're going to try this new weird thing, and then they're like, I don't know, I don't really want to try a new weird thing. So but if you are coming in
yes,
organized and prepared and conveying that, or at least conveying the confidence that this is going to be a great effective learning thing for them, then they're gonna get more buy-in.
totally.
Because why wouldn't they? Yeah.
Yeah. And like, just even like, you will be prepared to take the exam. Do you know what I mean? And you will be prepared for the following course in this semester or in this
Yes. Oh, I
sequence.
love
And
that.
like, all of those things are like, you know, when I'm being very cynical, and maybe at first when I started teaching, you're like, oh, students just want to get A's, they want easy A's. And it's not true, really. Do you know what I mean? Like, most of them, like, I've seen people like genuinely anxious about, am I going to be okay to take the next course? Or how is this going to, like, will this set me up for grad school? Or
Sure.
do I understand this material? You know, so I think there is very genuine learning motivation from students. And so believing that it's going to, like, all work out, I think is really important to them.
Yes.
And I think the other fundamental, I think, that's really important is, I hate the phrase, but having a safe space in the classroom.
Okay.
You know, and I think having an organized professor is part of that, but just a general sense of like, okay, we can do this active learning worksheet, and I know we're still going to cover stuff, and it is going to benefit me in some way. You know what I mean? And that kind of thing. So it's not going to be like, okay, we're going to do all this, like, you know, musings and active stuff, and then the final is going to be super hardcore theory that we never covered. Or do you know what I mean? Like, they believe that. And then also, I think active learning is so great and I love it, but if you're not going to, like, if you're going to just, if it's just a total free-for-all where, like, students can be mean to each other, or like one student can take over and just, like, send everybody down the wrong path, like, there still needs to be boundaries and structure to make sure everybody's okay in the situation. So I think that's really important too.
I love
because,
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're basically providing students with some reason to be confident that what we're doing in this classroom is going to be useful for their learning and for their next steps down the road. And you're also giving them a place where they can be comfortable in trying to learn this. And all of that's going to help be more effective for them to learn whatever it is we're trying to teach them.
And like, if you're going to say, have a situation where you have, everyone's going to present stuff on the board, great. But if you're going to do that and then let people be horrible or rude about it, then that's awful. And you know what I mean? So I don't think you can, like, I think a lot of those things actually require people to be quite vulnerable. So if you're not going to kind of honor that and make sure that, no, you know what I mean? Then
I do.
It's totally fine, because you don't have to do those things. But if you are going to do them, I think you really have to work to make sure that, like, people aren't going to be in an unpleasant experience.
Yeah, I love that. So a fundamental is providing a place where the students can be comfortable going through this process of learning, which was going to allow them to be more effective at learning.
Right, like, I've definitely seen people, and like, this is their kind of conviction, and that's fine, but it's like, you know, maybe say active learning, and like, people are having a debating style situation, and they're like, well, that's what it's going to be like in the real world, and but it's not the real world, and we're grading this, and like, you know what I mean? So I think making sure that, like, You know what I mean? Like, there's still a grown-up in the room who's going to be like, okay,
Right.
whoa there, buddy, that's not what we're doing. Or, you know,
Sure,
like,
there's somebody moderating
right.
how, I mean, I feel like we're kind of getting back to, we had an episode on Sage on the Stage where it was like,
Yes.
there's somebody who is the expert on the content who is handling the delivery of this content. And for me, that includes moderating this discussion or setting up the situation so that we're going to actually cover the right content and do it in a way that's hopefully effective for the students to learn by not making them embarrassed that they don't already know it or whatever
Totally.
it might be. Yeah.
And there's like, okay, so sorry, I'm still on
Totally.
my whole thing here, my soapbox, but there's a thing with like kind of learning that self-discovery, which is so powerful when it works, right? But then students get quite anxious. They're like, can I have the right answer eventually, though? Do you know what I mean? Because, and I don't know how to do that in a way that's not like going to make them just go through the motions where they really are still relying on the right answer. But if we're creating a situation where we're going to grade them on correct answers eventually, the self-discovery thing, especially if you have one person who's adamant they're correct, do you know what I mean? And that's where I feel like the adult in the room is really important to like.
I think so. Somebody has to be directing us to eventually arrive at the right answer. And,
right.
And in a way where hopefully through the process of discovery, that's been a useful tool to help them remember or understand more fully or something like that. Like, why are we doing the self-discovery? So the self-discovery might be a fad, but the fundamental is we're trying to help the students learn this stuff and have it a deeper understanding or a more solid understanding or remember it better or whatever the fundamental is. And so we have to make sure that we're achieving that fundamental with the fad.
Yes. And the thing is, this is all to say that I love fads. I'm a big fan of the fads, you know what I mean? And like, they're super exciting and like definitely like generating, you know what I mean? Like when you hear ideas, and I always have to like rein myself in after you go to a conference. You're like, oh, I'm going to try all.
I want to try 50 things. Yeah,
totally.
I know.
But I think it's just very. Like I think I told you that initially I was like, think, pair, share. Sure, I totally do think, pair, share.
Mm-hmm.
But like I didn't really understand what it was about, and when I
Exactly.
actually heard what it was about, I was like, oh, I was very much skimming the surface of what that was and missing a lot of the fundamentals about it. And
Sure.
even I think I've heard so like a big thing, you know, we've talked about it here is pronouns, you know, and I think that's, I'm saying it's a fad as in it's a new thing that's happened and it's really important, but I think the fundamentals then of having it be a safe situation for people and it's organized and it's not just like, that's really important to protect people and make sure that they feel okay.
Exactly. I totally agree. The fundamental is we're creating a environment where the students feel comfortable and can learn. And then this is a particular aspect of that. How are we going to go about that in this particular case?
Right.
Yeah.
Totally. So I think, yeah, like I think there's definitely merits to fads, but I think the fundamentals are fundamental, which is super,
fads are different.
Annoying,
I'm super into fads too, because there are all of us discussing different ways of achieving our fundamentals. And I tried this new thing, and that maybe is more effective at achieving the fundamental. Let's talk about that. Wonderful, absolutely love it.
And I think too, like not having this is sort of weird because other times I've been like, sometimes you just have to commit to something, but don't let the fad compromise the fundamental. Do you know what I mean?
Totally.
And so like if you're like super like, oh, we're going to try this thing where everyone has to stand up and say their darkest fear about physics or like and then you're like, okay, this is going against the whole thing where I don't want people to be exposed
it's not
and uncomfortable. Working. Yeah.
Now
okay,
that's interesting. So that that relates beautifully to my working on.
Oh, sweet.
Which is so another fad which has all these fundamental positive things of engaged students and all that is the flipped classroom, which is where the faculty member records lectures in advance, the students watch the lectures in advance, and then in your normal dedicated lecture time, you're kind of more doing homework. You're working on problems in groups and that kind of thing. And I'm confident that some people do a great job of it, but for me, it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're trying this new fad to achieve the fundamental of student engagement, and I feel like we've lost too much of the master of the concepts, presenting the material. It's more, we've gone too far away from students learning things into students are active, thinking about the material, but maybe not learning the content, at least when I imagine myself setting up such a classroom, or when I imagine myself as a student in the classroom. So again, some people definitely do this very well, but for me, I'm still working on understanding how I would do a flipped classroom, maintaining those fundamentals. And so I think, for sure, the people who are doing flipped classrooms are actually trying to hit the same fundamentals I am. But yeah, when I imagine myself as a student or facilitating a flipped classroom, I feel like it wouldn't work for me. So I'm still working on understanding how to keep those fundamentals in that particular fad.
Wow. Yeah, the flipped classroom is one I really struggle with too. Do you know what I mean? And I think partly my issue with the flipped classroom is like, I think there's this kind of fundamental fallacy that there's X amount of content you have to cover, and that's, do you know what I mean? And like, I guess the flipped classroom is trying to accommodate having active learning while still maintaining the exact same, you know what I mean? And
sure.
so I think that's something I really struggle with, because I do think, I don't know what I think, but I find for the last couple of years I've been lecturing in videos and then meeting with people to do like tutorial stuff, and I don't like lecturing in videos only. Do you know what I mean? I much prefer doing it in the classroom. I don't know why I'm taking over and making this about me, whether I should do the classroom or not, but is it something you actually want to do?
It's not something that I want to do.
Yes.
I think it's an example of me saying, I see what they're saying. The idea with the flipped classroom, I'm totally on board with the idea being that the engagement with the material and the students interacting with it is actually a very important part, and so we're going to prioritize that by putting it in the lecture time and making sure that they're actually doing that rather than having it be the homework, which is less guided. And so making the really important student engagement time be really guided. I totally am behind that fundamental, but I think, it's an example of me being okay rejecting a fad. I want to go about those fundamentals in a different way. Just
do you know what's funny? Okay, so like I know not age-wise, because you're certainly not like old, but like, you know, the way as we're getting older as teachers, I love that though, that you can be like, oh, that's very cool, and it's not for me. Like just being able to identify like what your fundamentals are and being like, oh wow, but no thank you.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Not gonna be...
Like it's cool. I'm glad people are doing it, but I'm not going to be one of them, and that's fine.
Right, and I think there is, like, I don't know where I necessarily think this is coming from, but sometimes there is a sense of pressure that like a thing comes along, and then why aren't you doing the thing? And right, and it's like not necessarily, I think if you know enough about yourself, because then so there's totally people who that's like, this really like, lines up with what I
really
like.
jives with them, I'm sure.
Yeah. Totally. So I think that's very cool to point out. You don't always have to jump on.
You don't always have to jump on. It's fun to learn about them and hear about them and think about them, and that I think is useful. It's useful that I thought about it, even though I decided, it's not what I'm going to do. Yeah,
it kind of like, okay, so my working on, I think I've talked about this already a bit in the first part. I've got two things, but one is like just whatever you do as a fad cannot generate more anxiety for students. And I know, and sometimes, I mean, I don't think I would say any anxiety for students, because students are obviously sometimes like maybe uncomfortable with active learning. Do you know what I mean? And like, you know, all of that stuff. But I think anything, it's just that thing, like if it's just because something's cool doesn't mean it's necessarily the thing.
Yes.
And I think one thing I struggle a bit with is like, this is going to sound weird, but like almost the marketing around some of these things, and that it ends up being like, it kind of reminds me of diets where it's like, no, like being a vegan is the thing that's going to save you, or like being a carnivore is the thing. And it's so extreme in what it's saying, you know what I mean? And I think it's just that thing. And I think this is true with diets, that some things work for some people and some things work for other people. And trying to like blanketly, that's not a word, but like apply something just in generalities, like, oh no, this is going to work for everybody. It's just nonsense.
Sure.
And even like to even think that necessarily something that works in physics is going to work in a completely different discipline you know, so I think that's something I've gotten better at holding in my head when I'm hearing about these kind of cool fads, that like this may not necessarily translate over to what I'm saying
Yeah, I
or
think
what
so
I'm
too.
teaching.
Exactly. Like different disciplines and different faculty members. Like my favorite activity might not work for you, or it might not work for physics, and that doesn't mean it doesn't work great for me. So totally. And that's really interesting about not generating more anxiety for the students. Like as you say, there might be inherently some just because we're changing up from something they're used to. You know, maybe they're not used to doing a worksheet, and so it's a little anxiety inducing to do a worksheet. But hopefully by day 3 of doing a worksheet, it'll be more relaxed because they're more used to it, and so that wouldn't be too much more anxiety.
Well,
Is that kind of what you're saying?
yeah, and I think, you know, not really people I know very well, but like I've definitely had brief interactions with people where they're like, "Oh, I'm doing this cool thing. The students all hate it, but they're just stupid. They don't know better." And I don't like that. Do you know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
sure, sometimes students don't totally know what's good for them, but like I think you still need to address it in some fashion and
Yeah.
take on board a bit of like what they're saying. Do you know what I mean? And
If they hate it, then maybe it hasn't been communicated properly, or maybe
Right.
there are some tweaks that are necessary. And, you know, I think it's true. Like we've talked about this before in the podcast, where I do have trouble where on my worksheet days, there's some students who are like, oh, are we just doing a worksheet day? I'm out
Yeah.
of here. And obviously I haven't convinced them that it's very valuable. And I try to say explicitly, no, we're doing a worksheet. Out of all the things we could have done today, I chose that we're doing this worksheet. But yeah, obviously, if they're not liking it, maybe there's more that could be done to help them like it. Or maybe they just need a little bit of time of getting used to it. But yes, I agree. If you're just pushing through and everybody's hating it and you're getting all this resistance, maybe there's something that could be adjusted to alleviate that
Right. Or,
resistance.
you know, and like there's limits, right? And like, but you know, if 5 people hate it, but 25 people are like, okay, you know, but if everyone is just stressed and
Right.
distressed, and I've just seen people digging their heels in and they're like, nope, this is what's best because so and so said it in their book that this is the best way to teach or whatever it is. And
So,
I think-
would you say in that case they're hanging on to the fad maybe at the cost of the fundamental?
oh,
Is that what's
absolutely.
happening?
Yes, totally. And I think like, and again, it could be that, so say if you're going to do a flipped classroom, obviously you have to be extremely organized. So like if people are doing a flipped classroom and they're not organized, that would be incredibly stressful for the students. Do you
Sure.
know what I
When is
mean?
the
And-
video going to be posted? I normally watch it right now, but it's not up yet,
Totally.
or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's super important. And I think, yeah, I just think, like, yeah, I don't know. Like being careful when you implement something the first time and really thinking about,
Yeah. Being reflective.
okay, here's my question. I have a question.
Oh, I was
for you.
about to remind you.
Good. So here's my
Unnecessary.
question, and I was thinking about this last night and wondering, but do you think when you start your career teaching, should you stick with the fundamentals? Do you know what I mean? And no fads until you really feel like I was thinking about some of the things I do, and I'm certainly was like, that would have been an absolute hot mess if I tried to do everything all at the same time. You know
That's
what I mean?
interesting. Well, I think you know, you have to write a teaching philosophy when you apply for most of these teaching positions, and I think I found that really helpful to determine what are my key fundamentals. What
Yeah.
are my tenets? And I remember writing like respect for the students and conveying that respect was really important to me. And so I think maybe thinking about what your fundamental teaching philosophies are, I guess I hesitate to say don't do any of the I mean, I think maybe it's coming back to don't try to do too much one semester,
Yes,
you know?
yeah.
So if you need to remake, if you're starting with some existing class, but you don't like a couple parts of it, well, change those couple parts of it, but don't try to revamp the whole thing, because that's just going to be too much.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think I have no problem doing fads that jive with you, but I wouldn't try to figure out how to make a fad jive with you while also doing
Right.
20 other things at once. I don't know. That's kind of what I'm like. I don't have
I
any
like your
objection
answer,
to
'cause
fads. It's
I
they're
think-
they're just a way of trying to get at the fundamentals. So if it's jiving with you, I'm down with it.
Right. I think it sounds like what you're saying, and I think what I would really agree with is like you have to identify what your fundamentals are, and then
Yes.
yeah,
Yes. Stick with your fads, but don't rush into newer fads if you don't know exactly how they fit with your fundamentals and they're not resonating with you.
right. And like I feel like I've gone to these talks before that were so interesting and exciting. But sometimes people, it almost is like an infomercial where it's like, if you apply my program for 30 days and all the research shows and like, and it makes you feel like you should not be doing anything you're currently doing and only doing this thing. And that to me doesn't sit well with me,
Exactly.
you know, because I think it's so important to identify your own personality when you're teaching and just applying someone else's.
I agree.
And I feel like I'm contradicting myself too, because I'm like, oh, I didn't know what think per share was, and then I learned. But I don't know. There's something in there about.
I think we all have experience. Like by the time we're teaching, we've all been a student for a long time, and we have some understanding of what things didn't jive with us and what things did as students. And I feel like that is helping us understand what we want to do in our classrooms, and maybe a new fad that we didn't experience as a student, but we're like, oh, that's really cool, that fits perfectly.
Yeah.
Man,
this is very interesting.
Anyway, very interesting. That's a really cool question.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. We're delighted to have you as a listener, and we would love to hear from you. And if you want to email us, our address is contactprofessorpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear any of your suggestions for future shows or professor quotes that you might want to share with us, or even just things that have come up for you when you were listening to previous episodes. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, we would love if you would spread the word. So the best way to spread word is by telling people you know if you think they should listen to it, or you can leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.